Margaret Rose Sullivan did not scream when the cabin door closed behind the man who had bought her. She only stood near the hearth with both hands locked so tightly that her knuckles turned white, waiting for the moment his kindness would end and his real purpose would begin. He had said almost nothing on the long ride from town. He had not looked at her much either. That made it worse somehow. A cruel man was easy to hate. A silent man gave fear too much room to grow. When he pointed to the narrow cot near the wall and told her she could sleep there, relief hit so hard it almost hurt. But relief was not trust. Not yet. She had been sold by her own father before sundown. She was not foolish enough to believe one small mercy made her safe. He set her canvas sack beside the cot and turned away at once, as if even looking at her too long would be a kind of theft. Margaret watched his broad back, her heart hammering, while he ladled stew into 2 bowls and placed one at the far end of the table for her. No smile. No command for her to sit close. No hand reaching out to claim what the law said was his. Just a quiet meal waiting in a warm room. She hated that her eyes stung at something so simple. Hated that after one day of fear, a bowl of hot stew felt like a miracle. When he finally spoke, his deep voice was as calm as banked fire. "Eat before it cools. We can sort the rest tomorrow." Margaret lowered herself into the chair, still in her coat, still ready to bolt even though there was nowhere to run. Across from her sat the mountain man everyone had feared for her. And for the first time since her father named his price, she felt something stranger than terror. She felt confused. The cabin was not what she had imagined. She had expected filth, skins thrown in corners, stale drink, and the smell of neglect. Instead, the place was neat enough to shame many women she knew in town. Iron pots hung in careful order by the stove. Wood had been stacked dry and straight beside the hearth. Shelves lined one wall, holding jars, folded cloth, and books. Books. Margaret kept glancing at them as if they might vanish when she blinked. The man sitting across from her did not fit the gossip that had clung to his name like burrs. He was rough-looking, yes. His shoulders looked wide enough to carry a tree. A scar cut through one eyebrow and another marked the line of his jaw. But his hands, the hands that broke bread and lifted the kettle, moved with a care she had not seen in her father since before whiskey swallowed him whole. She took one cautious bite of the stew, then another. Venison. Wild onion. A little thyme. It was good, better than good. She had not realized how hungry she was until the warmth began to spread through her chest. He ate without speaking and did not once stare at her mouth or body. That unsettled her almost more than open hunger would have. At least hunger had a name. This gentleness did not. When the bowls were empty, he stood and rinsed them in silence. Then he crossed to a wooden chest near the wall, opened it, and pulled out a thick wolf pelt and an extra blanket. He laid both on the cot before stepping back. "Nights get cold up here. Use those." Margaret swallowed hard. "Thank you." He gave one short nod as if thanks embarrassed him, then moved to the far side of the room and began unrolling his own bed on the larger frame there. The distance between the 2 beds was not much, but it felt like a promise. She sat on the cot after he turned away, her pulse beginning at last to slow. Her father's voice still rang in her ears. "Be grateful. He's paying 800, as if a number could clean the shame from what had happened. She had not cried in town. She had not cried during the rushed ceremony on the Trading Post porch with Josiah Turner smiling like a snake in church clothes. She had not cried on the ride into the mountains either, though the cold had bitten her face raw and the dark had swallowed every road back to the life she knew. But sitting there now, staring at the pelt he had given her without a word, she felt tears rise anyway. She blinked them back before he could turn. She would not let this stranger see her break on the first night. Whatever else he was, he had bought her. That truth sat in the room with them, heavier than the winter outside. He finished banking the fire and finally looked at her full on. His gray eyes held no drink, no lust, no smirking victory. Only tiredness. Bone-deep tiredness. "There's water by the stove if you need to wash. Privy's behind the cabin. Don't go out after dark unless I'm with you." She nodded. He hesitated, then added, "There are wolves around, but they won't bother the cabin." Margaret almost laughed at that. Wolves did not trouble her half so much as men did. She took her Bible from her sack and set it beside the cot, then her silver brush, then the little sewing kit her mother had once used. Small things, thin things. But they were all she had left from the life behind her. When she turned back, he was seated near the hearth, carving a small piece of wood with a knife so sharp it caught the firelight. The motion was steady and familiar. A man keeping his hands busy. A man avoiding frightening her. A man she did not understand. At last she found enough voice to ask the question that had burned in her since her father first spoke his name. Why did you do it? He did not pretend not to know what she meant. For a few moments, only the soft scrape of blade on wood filled the room. Then he said, because Turner said if I did not take the bargain, he'd send you to the mining camps. Margaret went still. She had heard whispers of those camps. Girls bought cheap. Girls broken fast. He kept carving while he spoke, as if the words came easier when his eyes were not on her. I didn't want a wife. Didn't go looking for one, just knew what would happen if I walked away. She stared at him. So you paid my father to save me. His knife paused. I paid your father because the law would call it marriage. But yes, better here than there. It was the plainest answer she had ever heard, and somehow the kindest. Something inside her shifted then. Not trust. Trust was too big, too precious, too dangerous. But the ground under her fear changed shape. She had thought herself dragged from one kind of captivity into another. Now she saw the edges of a different truth. He had not won her in some contest. He had stepped into a rotten bargain because no one else would. It did not erase the humiliation. It did not undo the fact that her father had sold her with a steady hand, but it changed the man before her. When Elijah, for that was the name the preacher had spoken, lifted the carving at last, she saw it was a bird no bigger than his palm. Its wings were folded, its head bowed. Even in rough pine it looked gentle. He noticed her looking and set it aside almost at once, as though private things should stay private. Margaret lay down on the cot and pulled the blanket over herself, then the pelt. Heat wrapped around her in a way she had not expected. Warmth from the fire, warmth from the bed, warmth from the quiet care of a man who had every right, by cruel law, to demand more and had demanded nothing at all. She did not sleep quickly. She listened to him move through the cabin, putting out the lamp, checking the door bar, laying another split log on the coals. Each sound fixed itself in her mind. Useful sounds, safe sounds, the kind a woman learns when she does not know whether the dark holds danger or shelter. At some point, he crossed halfway toward her bed and stopped. Margaret kept her breathing even, pretending sleep. For one sharp second, fear grabbed her throat again. Then she felt his hand only on the edge of the pelt, tugging it higher over her shoulder where a draft had found its way in. He retreated at once. No word, no lingering, just a quiet act done in darkness when he thought she would never know. Margaret closed her eyes against sudden tears. She had spent all day being traded, ordered, and looked over. Yet the first man to treat her like something human had been the one everyone warned her to fear. By dawn, the mountains would still be hard, the snow still deep, and the road back to town still gone. None of that had changed. Her father remained a coward. The law remained cruel. She was still married to a stranger in a lonely cabin high above the world she knew. But as she lay listening to the slow, steady breathing from the other side of the room, Margaret realized one thing had changed after all. She was no longer certain the mountain man was the danger. And that frightened her in a new way, because hope, even a little of it, could break a heart more surely than fear. The day after the storm, Margaret woke to find Elijah already up and tending to the fire. His movements were deliberate, practiced, the way someone moved when they had lived with a single purpose for so long. His back was to her as she pulled herself up from the cot, and for a long moment she simply watched him. His size seemed to fill the space, but it was his stillness that held her attention. It was as if nothing could surprise him, nothing could rattle the quiet rhythm of his days. The only thing that seemed to shift was the way he looked at her, as if she were a new thing that didn't quite belong but might, someday, fit. Margaret swung her legs over the edge of the bed, feeling the cold touch of the floor against her bare feet. She had not expected to sleep at all last night, and yet she had. Not deeply, not with peace, but the rhythm of the fire, the wind outside, and the soft hum of his quiet movements had settled her in a way she couldn't explain. As she moved toward the stove, Elijah glanced up, his gray eyes catching hers for just a moment before he turned away. He didn't smile. He didn't frown. He just watched her with that same quiet attentiveness. "Coffee's brewing," he said, his voice as calm as always. Margaret nodded, surprised by the lack of tension in her shoulders. Her heart was still full of unanswered questions, but she did not feel the same panic she had yesterday. Maybe it was because the storm had passed. Maybe it was because she hadn't been dragged back to town yet, hadn't faced the consequences of the arrangement that had shackled her to this cabin. Whatever the reason, she could breathe here in the quiet. Here, in this strange space between captivity and freedom, she felt something she hadn't in weeks, a small flicker of choice. She sat at the rough-hewn table, her hands wrapped around a mug of steaming coffee Elijah had placed in front of her without asking. For a moment, they sat in silence. The cabin was not large, but it felt as if it could hold them both in a way the world outside never had. When she finally spoke, her voice felt strange, like a forgotten sound. "I don't know how to cook like you do," she said softly, looking at the spoon he had left beside her bowl of stew. It was a weak attempt at conversation, but it was the only thing that came to her. She had never been good at talking to strangers, never good at speaking when she was afraid. Elijah paused, his knife stilling over the chunk of wood in his hands. "There's time for that," he said. His tone was simple, without any expectation, without any judgment. Just there. The kind of voice that made you feel like you could take your time, figure things out, and maybe, just maybe, something would click. Margaret nodded. She did not know what else to say, so she focused on the spoon in her hand, turning it slowly in the bowl. The silence between them stretched, but it didn't feel uncomfortable. It wasn't the heavy kind of silence that came when you didn't know what to say or where to go next. This felt different. The silence here was full of room to breathe, room to think. It wasn't pressing against her, trying to force words from her lips. At last, Elijah spoke again. "You're welcome here, Margaret, for as long as you need." He said her name like he had always known it, as if it fit in his mouth the way it never fit her father's. Her throat tightened at the words, though she could not explain why. She had never wanted to be here. She had never wanted to be sold in the first place. But his words, soft and sure, filled a space she had not realized was there. His kindness was not for her to take lightly, and yet she could not seem to find a way to refuse it, even if she wanted to. "I'm not asking for anything," he continued, still focused on his carving, though his eyes seemed to search her face as if trying to measure the weight of her thoughts. "Just don't think you're a prisoner. This is your choice, too, now." Margaret froze, her hand stilling over her bowl. He had said it so simply, like a fact, but the weight of it was enormous. Choice. She had not had a choice in years, not when her father had gambled her away, not when the town had treated her like some kind of shameful possession. Choice had not existed for her, until now. "Why did you offer to take me?" she asked, her voice hoarse despite the calmness she tried to project. Elijah's gaze moved over her then, but he didn't look away. He didn't seem uncomfortable with the question, as if he had expected it. "Because it was the right thing to do," he answered simply, with that same quiet confidence. "The world doesn't always give us good choices, but we still have to make them. I did what I had to." Margaret didn't know how to respond to that, so she said nothing. There was no argument in her, no rebellion, only a strange recognition of something she had not expected to find: compassion, care. He set his carving down, finally turning to face her fully. "When I got the letter from your father, I didn't know what I was walking into. I still don't know what you expect from me or what's going to happen next. But you should know this: you're not his anymore. You're here by your own decision now. No one's forcing you to stay." The cabin had grown colder, but the warmth between them felt more potent than any fire could provide. Margaret felt the truth of his words settle into her bones. She was here. She had not chosen this, not at first. But now she did have a choice. She had the right to decide her next step. The silence hung heavy again, but it was no longer a silence of fear. It was one filled with potential, with space for what could grow. Margaret did not know what that would be yet, but she was beginning to see the possibility. "Thank you," she said, the words tasting strange but somehow right. She didn't know what else to say, but at least she could offer gratitude for the space she had been given. Elijah nodded once, standing from the table and stretching. "Rest for now. We'll make a start tomorrow. You'll be able to take care of yourself. I'll teach you. You can stay as long as you need." Margaret nodded, uncertain of what that future would look like, but feeling the first glimmer of something that had been missing for so long. Hope. The kind of hope that lived not in grand promises, but in small acts of kindness, in silent understanding, in a mountain man who did not seek to claim her as his possession, but instead offered her the possibility of a life built on her own choices. The world outside the cabin was cold, unforgiving, and still full of uncertainties. But here, inside, the fire burned steady, and there was warmth to be found. In the silence, in the space between them, Margaret could almost believe that a new life was possible. The days passed slowly, each one stretching out in front of Margaret like a long, uncertain path. The snow continued to fall, a quiet, persistent presence in the mountains, as if time itself had slowed down to match the rhythm of her new life. The cabin had become a place of strange comfort. The rough wood walls and small, tidy space no longer felt like a cage. There was work to do, chores to be completed, and Elijah's steady presence made everything seem bearable. Margaret kept to herself mostly, still unsure how to exist in this new reality. Elijah gave her space, as if he, too, was still trying to figure out what they were now, married, but strangers to one another in so many ways. He never rushed her, never pressed her for anything beyond what she was ready to offer. His kindness, though, was a constant, like the steady heat of the stove or the quiet crackling of the fire at night. They spoke little, their conversations mostly practical. Elijah showed her how to tend the stove, how to manage the water barrels, how to mend clothes and gather firewood without making the task feel like a chore. His lessons were straightforward, no words wasted, but in those moments, Margaret learned more than just survival. She learned that this man, this mountain man, was not the brutish figure she had imagined. He was patient, careful, and even in his silence he made her feel seen. His quiet was not a wall, it was simply the way he spoke to the world, soft but steady. One evening, as the sun dipped low behind the peaks, Elijah returned from checking his traps. Margaret had been standing by the stove, stirring a pot of stew when he walked in. The cold air clung to him, his breath visible in the dimming light. She glanced over her shoulder, and their eyes met for the briefest moment. There was something in his gaze, something that had not been there before, a flicker of something she couldn't quite place. "You're getting better at that," he said, nodding toward the stew pot. "Looks good." Margaret smiled shyly, wiping her hands on her apron. "I'm learning," she replied, her voice soft but not as hesitant as it had been in the days before. Elijah set down his pack and moved to the small table, pulling out a chair with his usual quiet efficiency. He didn't ask her to sit with him, but the space between them felt different. He wasn't rushing, wasn't waiting for her to fill the silence with awkward chatter. Instead, they just existed in the same room, both working on their tasks, both learning how to live in a shared space without words needing to fill every gap. It was strange how easy it was becoming. Margaret had expected to feel suffocated by the stillness of the cabin, expected to resent the quiet. But it was the quiet that gave her room to breathe, room to think, room to heal. With each passing day, the man who had once seemed so distant was becoming a presence she could rely on. That evening, after they had eaten, Elijah surprised her by pulling out a book from the shelf. It was an old, leather-bound volume, worn at the edges, the title barely legible. Margaret recognized it as one of the books she had found in the trunk under his bed. She had always wondered what kind of man Elijah Stone was, beyond the quiet mountain man he appeared to be. But this small act, reaching for a book when there was no need to, told her something new. It was something gentle, something tender. "I thought you might like this one," he said, holding up the book, his hands a little unsure, as if offering it was a risk. "It's poetry, not much of a reader, but some of it's good." Margaret blinked, surprised by the unexpected gesture. Poetry, she asked, her voice thick with curiosity. She had never imagined Elijah as someone who would enjoy such things. The mountain men she had heard about, rough, silent, and grim, never seemed like the type to read anything so delicate. He shrugged, but there was a faint flush on his cheeks, a hint of vulnerability in the way he held the book. Keeps the mind busy when the snow piles up and the days get too long. Helps me pass the time when I'm alone. Margaret nodded slowly, her fingers reaching out to take the book. It was heavy in her hands, a different weight than what she had expected. "I'll read it," she said softly, unsure of what else to say. She wanted to ask why he had never mentioned it before, why he was sharing it now, but the words caught in her throat. Instead, she opened to the first page, the worn pages rustling under her fingertips. Elijah sat back, watching her with that same quiet intensity. The fire crackled between them, its warmth filling the space, but neither of them spoke. Margaret began to read aloud, her voice hesitant at first but growing steadier as she found her rhythm. The words were old, familiar, and strange all at once, and they filled the room with something new, something she hadn't known she needed. As the night stretched on, they shared the book in silence, passing it back and forth. Elijah read a few lines himself, his voice low and steady, and Margaret found herself surprised by the strength of his words, by the way he brought the poetry to life in a way she hadn't expected. It wasn't like reading at home, where her mother had done most of the talking, her voice full of warmth and comfort. This was different. This was raw, quiet, and honest. When they finished the poem, the silence stretched between them, but it wasn't uncomfortable. Margaret could feel the weight of Elijah's presence beside her, and for the first time since she had arrived in the mountains, she didn't feel so alone. "I'm glad you're here," Elijah said suddenly, his voice so soft it was almost a whisper. Margaret turned to look at him, her heart skipping at the unexpected words. She had not expected to hear anything like that, not from him, not in this place. She opened her mouth to speak, but no words came. All she could do was nod, her throat tight with emotion. She didn't know what it meant or where it would lead, but she knew one thing. She wasn't running anymore. She wasn't alone. And for the first time since she had been sold to this man, Margaret Rose Sullivan felt the faintest stirrings of hope. The future was still unknown, still filled with questions and uncertainties, but now it was something she could face without fear. The mornings had become routine, and with routine came something Margaret had not expected: peace. She had imagined the mountain life would wear her down, a harsh life of endless labor under a sky that offered nothing but snow and cold. But instead there was rhythm here. The days fell into each other like the turning of the seasons, subtle but steady. She rose before the sun just as Elijah did, and they worked side by side in the silence of the cabin. Elijah had taught her how to set traps, how to check them without disturbing the land. His instructions were short, but his care was evident in every movement. He had a quiet, patient way about him, as though he understood the land like a familiar song. Margaret wasn't sure she would ever get used to his calm, but she had come to rely on it. Each day, she grew a little more accustomed to his quiet strength, a little more settled in this strange, unexpected partnership. One morning, after Elijah had gone out to check his traps, Margaret found herself standing in front of the small, hand-carved shelf by her bed, her fingers lightly tracing the edge of a weathered book Elijah had given her. It was Shakespeare, his favorite. At first, the idea of reading something so far removed from the simple life she had known had felt like a luxury she couldn't afford. But now, she had begun to understand why he cherished it. There was something about the words, about the way they captured the vastness of human emotion, that made her feel less alone. It was as if she was learning to see the world not just through her own eyes, but through the eyes of someone who had lived so much more of it. She had been reading Hamlet, and though she didn't understand everything, something in the prince's melancholy and regret felt familiar. Margaret closed the book with a sigh, setting it aside. She had been in this cabin for almost 2 weeks now, but she still didn't know how to place herself here. Was she a wife, a servant, a guest? She wasn't sure how she fit into Elijah's world yet, but she was beginning to realize that, for the first time, There was space for her to exist without the weight of her father's expectations or the town's gossip. She was free here in this cabin, and maybe, just maybe, she could become something more than just the girl who had been sold. The door opened with a creak, and Elijah stepped in, shaking snow from his coat. He was carrying a bundle of pelts across his shoulders, his eyes scanning the room before landing on her. There was a quiet steadiness in his gaze, a calmness that always seemed to settle her. "You're up early," he remarked, his voice low but not cold. It was simply a statement, as though he had come to expect her to rise with the sun. Margaret smiled, a soft, uncertain smile. "I didn't sleep well last night," she admitted, rubbing her hand over her eyes. "But I'm getting used to the quiet." He nodded, as if he understood exactly what she meant. Elijah moved to the table and began to remove his gear, laying the pelts out with practiced care. He didn't ask questions, didn't prod. He simply went about his task, and Margaret found herself watching him, captivated by the ease with which he moved. There was a certain grace in the way he worked, even though everything he did was rooted in necessity, in survival. "I can help," she said after a moment, surprising herself with the offer. She hadn't expected to say it, but the words felt right in the space between them. She didn't want to feel like an outsider in her own home. She wanted to be a part of this, to contribute in whatever way she could. Elijah paused for a brief moment before looking up at her. His expression didn't change much, but there was a flicker of something, recognition maybe. "You've already helped more than you know," he said quietly. Margaret's heart skipped at the unexpected compliment. She wasn't used to kindness, not the kind that was given freely without expectation. It left her unsure of how to respond, so she simply nodded and moved to the corner where the firewood was stacked. She began to sort through it, feeling the weight of her own thoughts settle around her. The act was simple, but it was something she could do. It was a way to belong. As they worked, the quiet of the cabin was broken only by the crackle of the fire and the rhythmic sounds of their movements. Elijah spoke only when necessary, as if words were best reserved for moments that mattered. Yet in the silence, Margaret felt the slow burn of something growing between them. It wasn't love, not yet, but it was respect, and it was something she could hold on to. Later that day, Elijah asked if she wanted to go with him to the trading post to pick up supplies. Margaret hesitated, unsure of what to expect from town now. Would people recognize her as the mountain man's wife? Would they whisper behind her back as they had before? "I'll stay in the wagon if that's easier," he added, as if sensing her unease. Margaret considered his offer. There was a small part of her that still feared being seen in town, still feared being judged for the bargain her father had made. But there was another part of her that wanted to stand beside Elijah, to be seen with him, to let the world see that she was not just the girl who had been sold, but the woman who had chosen this life. "I'll come," she said finally, her voice firmer than she had expected. "I think it's time." Elijah gave her a nod, his expression unreadable. He didn't comment further, simply preparing the wagon and the horses. Margaret followed him outside, the crisp air biting at her cheeks, but there was something in the way Elijah moved, something in the steady rhythm of his actions, that made her feel a little less afraid. The town came into view as they descended from the mountain, the small collection of buildings stark against the white of the snow-covered landscape. It felt smaller than she remembered, quieter. When they arrived at the trading post, the usual bustle of men and women going about their business was missing. The place felt abandoned, as if everyone had gone to bed early to escape the cold. Inside, Margaret hesitated, standing near the door as Elijah spoke to the storekeeper. She could feel the weight of eyes on her, even though no one said anything. The whispers were subtle, the glances quick, but they were there. The merchant gave her a long look, his eyes flicking from her to Elijah, then back again. It was the first time she had been seen in public as Elijah's wife, and the reality of it hit her like a stone in the chest. The storekeeper, a middle-aged man with a beard, cleared his throat. "How's the winter treating you?" he asked, his voice too loud in the silence. Elijah didn't seem to notice the tension in the room. "Cold, but we've managed," he replied, his voice steady. Margaret stood there, hands folded in front of her, unsure of what to do or say. She had never felt so out of place in her life. The life she had left behind seemed distant now, as if it belonged to someone else. Yet in the stillness of the trading post, in the space between her and Elijah, she realized something. She was no longer afraid of what the world thought of her. She had chosen this, had made a life with this man, and that was enough. The merchant continued to speak to Elijah, but Margaret tuned out the words, letting her thoughts wander. The world had always seemed so big and overwhelming, but now, with Elijah beside her, she felt a little less alone. He didn't ask anything of her, didn't demand more than she was willing to give. He simply let her be. As they finished their transaction and made their way out of the post, Margaret breathed in the cold air deeply, feeling it fill her lungs. There was no going back now. She wasn't sure what the future held, but for the first time in a long while she felt like she might be ready to face it. With Elijah beside her, there was something solid underfoot, something to hold onto. The past had been cruel, but it had also brought her here. And here, with him, was where she was meant to be. The weeks that followed their trip to town marked a subtle shift in the rhythms of life. The early days of her marriage to Elijah had been full of uncertainty, a slow, careful dance between two strangers bound by a bargain neither of them had sought. But as the winter days stretched longer, something else began to grow between them. Not love, not yet, but a quiet partnership, a shared understanding built on silence, small gestures, and the soft, unspoken ways they tended to each other. Margaret had learned to live with the stillness of the cabin and with Elijah's quiet presence. In the mornings, he would leave before dawn to check his traps, and Margaret would start the fire, boil water, and prepare breakfast. They spoke little during these early hours. Elijah was always focused, his movements methodical and sure, and Margaret, too, was becoming more accustomed to the steady rhythm of the work. She had learned how to cut firewood, how to skin an animal, how to read the signs of the land. Lessons Elijah taught her without fanfare, without any need for words. The learning itself was enough, but it wasn't just the tasks she was learning. It was the subtle shifts in their relationship. Over time, the small things Elijah did for her began to matter more than any grand gesture. The way he set an extra log on the fire when she shivered, the way he never made her feel as though she owed him for the food or the shelter. It was in his silence, in his quiet care, that Margaret began to understand the kind of man he was. He had never once raised his voice to her, never demanded more than she was willing to give. And in return, she began to see that she, too, could offer him something beyond just survival. One evening, after the sun had set and the cold of the night settled in, Elijah returned from his trap lines earlier than usual. Margaret had been sitting by the fire, mending one of her old dresses, when she heard his boots crunching on the snow outside. She didn't get up immediately, but her heart skipped a beat. The house was quieter when he was gone. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath in the absence of his steady presence. When he entered the cabin, shaking the snow from his coat, Margaret looked up from her work. She had learned to read his face, even though he didn't show much of what he was feeling. Tonight, though, there was something different in his eyes. A glimmer she hadn't seen before. He had a strange, almost hesitant look about him, as though he was carrying something heavy but didn't quite know how to put it down. He crossed the room slowly and Margaret stood, wiping her hands on her apron. "You're back early," she said, her voice light, though she couldn't hide the curiosity in her tone. Elijah gave her a small, distracted smile. "Had some time. Thought I'd bring in the last of the furs early." But that wasn't what was on his mind, she could tell. Something else was eating at him, and for a moment they stood there in silence, just watching each other. Margaret didn't push him. She had learned that about him. He would speak when he was ready. But she couldn't ignore the tightening in her chest. "Is everything all right?" she asked gently, unsure if she should ask at all. Elijah hesitated, looking down at the furs he had laid across the table, his hands hovering over them like he wasn't sure where to place them. Finally, he looked up at her, his expression unreadable. "Margaret," he said, his voice lower than usual, like he was testing the words before he spoke them. "There's something I've been meaning to ask you." Margaret's breath caught in her throat. She wasn't sure what she had expected, but this wasn't it. Elijah Stone, the man who had bought her to settle her father's debt, the man who had given her a home in the wilderness, was asking her something. "What is it?" she asked, her voice soft but steady. He stepped closer, but his gaze was still fixed on the furs, as though he was afraid of looking at her directly. I don't want to put you in a position where you feel trapped, where you feel like you owe me more than you can give. Margaret blinked, taken aback by his words. What was he saying? Hadn't they already established that she was here because of her father's debt? Hadn't they already settled this unspoken agreement between them? Yet there was a vulnerability in his voice now, something that made her heart twist. Trapped. She repeated, not understanding. I don't feel trapped. He finally lifted his gaze to meet hers, and for the first time in weeks, Margaret saw uncertainty in his eyes. I know you're here because of that debt, because your father, because of everything that happened. But that's not why I took you. Not really. I don't want you to think that I expect anything from you that you're not willing to give. Margaret's heart swelled at his words, the rawness in them. She had never heard him speak like this, had never seen him look so exposed. It made something tighten in her chest, a mix of sorrow and something else, something warmer. I'm here because I have nowhere else to go, she said quietly, her voice barely above a whisper. I'm here because I had no choice. Elijah nodded, his jaw tightening slightly. He stepped even closer, closing the space between them. But that doesn't mean you're trapped, and it doesn't mean you owe me anything. The weight of his words hung between them, and for a long moment, neither of them spoke. Margaret could feel the heat of his body so close to hers, and yet there was still a distance between them, one that neither of them had quite crossed. Finally, Margaret took a step forward, closing the gap, and gently placed a hand on his arm. She didn't know why she did it, only that she felt a strange sense of certainty when her fingers brushed his sleeve. Elijah stiffened at first, but then, without saying a word, he reached up and touched her hand, his fingers warm against her skin. I know you don't want me to feel like I owe you, she said softly, her voice barely audible. But I do. I owe you more than I can ever repay. You gave me a chance when no one else would. Elijah's gaze softened, and for the first time he seemed to relax into the moment, as if the tension between them had finally broken. He slowly pulled her into his arms, holding her gently but firmly, like a promise he wasn't quite ready to speak. I didn't take you for repayment, he murmured against her hair. I took you because I didn't want to watch you disappear into something worse, and I never wanted you to feel like you were being forced into something. You're not, Margaret. You never have been. Margaret closed her eyes, pressing her face against his chest. She couldn't explain what she was feeling. Too many emotions tangled inside her, too many things she had yet to understand. But in that moment, as Elijah held her, something inside her unraveled, something that had been buried deep. She wasn't sure what would come next, but she knew one thing for certain. She was no longer alone. The weeks that followed were like the turning of a page. It was as if the world outside had stopped pressing against them, and inside the cabin, Margaret could breathe in a way she never had before. The cold winds and the endless snow were still there, a constant presence in the mountains, but they no longer felt like threats. Here, in this little cabin tucked against the wilderness, Margaret began to understand what it meant to belong. Elijah was still a man of few words, but his actions spoke louder than anything he could say. They were partners now, even if the words still felt foreign to both of them. The silence between them was no longer uncomfortable. It was shared. He had given her space to grow into herself, to become something more than just the girl who had been sold. And in return, Margaret had begun to see him for the man he truly was, a man who had never asked for love, but had learned to give it anyway. One morning, after a long stretch of snow, Elijah returned from checking his traps earlier than usual. Margaret had been sitting by the fire, mending a coat, when she heard his boots crunching through the snow. The door opened, bringing in a rush of cold air, and he stepped inside, shaking snow from his coat and setting his pack on the table. "Snow's deeper than I thought," he said, wiping the sweat from his brow. His voice was tired, but there was something else in it today, something she couldn't place. Margaret stood from her chair, her heart quickening. "Is something wrong?" Elijah looked at her, his gray eyes softening as they met hers. No, just been thinking. Margaret frowned slightly, unsure of what he meant. About what? He took a step toward her, his movement slow, as if unsure of himself. He didn't say anything at first, just looked at her for a long moment like he was searching for the right words. When he spoke, his voice was quieter than usual, more uncertain. I never thought I'd have this, he said softly, his hand gesturing around the cabin. A life, a family. What? Margaret's heart gave a small, unsteady lurch. The word family felt so heavy in the air, yet it also felt right. In the months since she had come to the mountains, she had begun to realize that this, the life she was building here, was more than she had ever imagined possible. She had come expecting to survive, to simply exist. But in this cabin, with Elijah beside her, she had found something she hadn't known she was looking for. She took a step toward him, her breath catching as she realized how close they had become. What do you mean? She asked, her voice barely a whisper. Elijah didn't answer right away. Instead, he crossed the room and opened a chest by the fireplace. He pulled out a small bundle wrapped in cloth, setting it gently on the table. Margaret's eyes widened as she recognized the object inside. It was the carving. The one he had made for her, the small wolf she had seen weeks ago. But this one was different. The wolf had been carefully crafted, its eyes carved with such detail that they seemed to watch her with an almost lifelike intensity. The fur was smooth, and the pose was protective, as if the wolf were guarding something precious. I've been carving it for weeks, Elijah said quietly, his fingers brushing the edge of the wolf's tail. It's for you. Margaret's throat tightened, and she swallowed hard, trying to steady herself. This wasn't just a carving. This was a gift, a symbol of something she hadn't yet fully understood. Elijah had never been a man to offer things lightly. And yet here he was, giving her something that meant so much more than a simple carving. She reached out slowly, her fingers brushing the smooth surface of the wolf. The weight of it in her hand felt like a promise. It wasn't just the carving that moved her, it was the thought behind it. The care, the time, the unspoken bond that had been built between them. You carved this for me? She asked, her voice soft, trembling slightly with emotion. Elijah nodded, his gaze steady but tinged with a quiet vulnerability. You're the one who's brought life back into this place. You've changed everything. Margaret felt something shift inside her, a rush of warmth and understanding that settled deep in her chest. She had never imagined that a man like Elijah could see her like this, could understand the way she had struggled to find her place in the world. But here he was, seeing her, truly seeing her, and it made her heart ache with a mix of gratitude and something deeper, something that could only be called love, even if it was still unfamiliar. She looked up at him, her fingers still resting on the carving, and in that moment she knew. She had found her place here with him. Not because she had to, not because she was trapped, but because she wanted to. She had chosen this life, this man, and now, more than ever, she knew she had chosen the right thing. You don't have to carve me things, she said softly, her eyes never leaving the wolf. But I'm glad you did. He smiled at that, the smallest of smiles, but it was enough. You're the first person to ever make me feel like I belong somewhere, he said, his voice low but full of meaning. I can't thank you enough for that. Margaret's chest tightened, but she didn't pull away. She didn't need to say anything more because in that moment everything was clear. She wasn't just his wife. She wasn't just a woman sold into a life of hardship. She was his partner, his equal, and she had found her place in this world alongside him. Later that evening, as the fire crackled and the wolves howled in the distance, Margaret and Elijah sat side by side, the silence between them comfortable, warm. Margaret felt a peace she hadn't known in years. The world outside was still harsh, still full of uncertainty. But here in the cabin with Elijah she had found something worth holding on to. And as the night deepened, Elijah's hand brushed hers, not a tentative touch, but one that spoke of something solid and real. The mountain man's wife, she thought to herself. The words still unfamiliar, still new, but this time they didn't carry the weight they once had. They had become something else, something that felt like home. Tomorrow we'll work on the garden, Elijah said, breaking the quiet between them. I know it's late, but the snow's melting. It'll be good to start planting soon. Margaret smiled, a genuine smile that reached her eyes. "I'll help, but only if you teach me how to plant things properly." Elijah laughed softly, the sound of it filling the room with warmth. "Deal. But I'm warning you, my way's the only way." Margaret leaned her head against his shoulder, feeling the steady beat of his heart beneath her. She didn't know what tomorrow would bring, but whatever came, they would face it together. The night grew deeper, the fire slowly burning down to embers. But for the first time since she had come here, Margaret didn't feel the cold. She felt warmth, both from the fire and from the man beside her. The journey ahead was uncertain, but for the first time in a long while, Margaret felt something she had not known she could feel again. She felt hope.